This is the first of a few ambitious sessions on Back to Basics, where we're just going to look at some of the simple accessibility perks that you kind of get with HTML if you use it properly. Just kind of starting off, under the public sector body's accessibility regulations, it is actually illegal to push invalid HTML code into a live public sector website or digital service. So a lot of people think accessibility is a nice to have, but actually, if you work in the public sector, as we do, actually pushing invalid HTML is actually illegal because under the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG 2.1, there's a criterion called 4.1.1 parsen where it says basically your HTML code must be valid. That means it must follow the rules laid out in the specification. There is a fundamental lack of respect for HTML as a language. This is my experience of it anyway. Because most developers can make a page kind of look like the design, HTML and CSS are generally considered to be easy, but that means that there's a lot of people kind of using the wrong elements and marking things up incorrectly. Just because they look right doesn't necessarily mean that they are right under the hood. If you were to do a computer science degree, HTML isn't really studied as a specialism. It's kind of only covered in sort of full stack development as a module. The entire module is normally around 100 hours, but it'll also cover a whole bunch of other things like design principles, information architecture, authentication, security, standards, client and server side code, and usability and accessibility might be in there. But, you know, HTML isn't kind of studied in the same depths as, you know, other code and sort of principles. So a lot of the time people think they can do HTML, but they've not really studied it. They've just kind of glossed over it and they can do enough to get by. And another problem with HTML is that it's flexible. In some cases, it's probably too flexible. For example, there's 3 examples here. All 3 of them are valid HTML, but only one of them is actually correct. So you could have a button made of a button element. You can have a link which you've styled to look like a button, or you can have a div which you've styled to look like a button, but actually only one of them is going to be accessible because of the way that it's marked up. HTML is flexible, which is a good thing, but there are still rules. There's the spec or specification, and the rules of the language are kind of defined in there as to what you can and can't do with it. So one of the things that we sometimes see, particularly on SaaS products or sort of off-the-shelf products, are people just making up attributes and then targeting those with JavaScript. You can't just make up attributes. So for example, if you put an attribute on a div tag where you've put moo equals cow, you can hit that with JavaScript. You can, you know, write some code where you can grab that element and you can do stuff to it based on that attribute, but it is actually invalid. And if you ran your HTML through a parser, it's going to throw an error and say, actually, you can't, there's no such attribute as moo, therefore you can't use it. Also, a lot of people use boilerplate templates. A boilerplate is kind of a template which has what they consider to be the bare minimum elements in there that you need to start off a web page. It'll have things like a HTML tag, it'll have a head tag, it'll have a body tag. They've normally got like a Google Analytics script in there somewhere. They've got a link to a style sheet, a link to a script file usually. But they lack fundamental things that you need for accessibility. So for example, a lot of them don't ship with a main tag. And if you don't have a main tag, then it's going to be really difficult for people to find the actual main content of the page. So the boilerplate examples are good as a starting point, but they still expect you to know HTML. And unfortunately, a lot of people who use them do so because they're not entirely sure what they need to include in the first place. So they go and get the template, then they just start chucking their HTML into it, and they end up with things missing that they really should have. If ever you're kind of unsure on anything to do with HTML, then it's worth using the MDN website, the Mozilla Developer Network website. It is a full rundown of every element, kind of how it works, what attributes you can use on it, what attributes you can't use on it. It's a friendly version of the HTML spec, I guess. So we'll have a look at some of those things if there's time at the end. But if ever you're unsure of anything, just go to MDN and look it up, and that'll tell you everything that you need to know about that tag and how you can use it. And just kind of before we start into getting into the nitty gritty, I just want to kind of say, if you are building digital services, we always recommend using the GovUK design system and GovUK front end, because the components in there are tried and tested and are more likely to be accessible than kind of building your own from scratch. So before you kind of start deciding what tags you want to use and just building loads of crazy things, it is always advisable just to use the things that already exist out there, because it'll save you a lot of time and you'll probably end up with something that's a lot more accessible a lot more quickly. So the things that we're going to look at today are just common elements that you'll probably come across. Then we're going to look a little bit more in depth at headings, language, page titles, landmarks, and skip links. So common elements are just kind of the basic building blocks of HTML. Every HTML element has a purpose, and choosing the correct element is the easiest way to make anything accessible. So the main one you'll probably see is the paragraph element. This is denoted as a p tag. It's the simplest form of structured text. It's kind of used for anything which is basic content, and it should be used when the content doesn't better fit into another category. So most of the time your paragraph tag is a catch-all. If there's something else which fits, then that's going to take priority. If nothing else seems to fit, then it falls back to kind of a paragraph tag, but it's just for text on a page mainly. We have the division element, or the div tag. This is a decorative element. It's used to wrap blocks of content, which then gives you control over the design. You should never really use them for anything which is meaningful or interactive. You can modify, like we're doing another session on ARIA. You can use these things if you tag them up using the correct ARIA rules and things. But in all honesty, although it'll work, there's not normally any reason to use a div over another element. So they're purely decorative. They're kind of used to do layouts, to give you columns on a page, to increase the space between things, but they shouldn't really be used for anything interactive, or you have to do a whole bunch of extra work. So a lot of the common things that we sometimes see is people are using a div tag for a button when actually they should have just used a button tag or something. We also have the span element, which is, it's also decorative. So this is kind of the inline equivalent of the div tag. It's so that you can wrap parts of a sentence and kind of add stylistic choices. Again, they should never be used for anything interactive, and they should only be used where styles don't add context. So for example, you could say only 8% of the global population has blue eyes, and you might want to make the word blue actually look blue because it's a stylistic choice. But if you read the sentence without the span there, then it's, you know, it doesn't really add anything other than a little bit of style into the page. But you definitely don't want to be using it for anything which is important. We have the emphasis element, which should be used to emphasize certain words like you would in any natural language. It shouldn't be used simply to add italic styling. That is another sort of problem. We see people go, we want italics, and they're using a sort of emphasis tag. And actually that'll make screen readers emphasize words that they maybe shouldn't be emphasizing. So in this example, we've got, you should not use emphasis elements just because you like the look of italics, where the word not has been emphasized. And then when the screen reader reads it out, it will actually try and read it more in natural language, put an emphasis on the word not. The strong importance element, it's similar to the emphasis element, but it actually lends even stronger emphasis to them words. They are generally only used for really urgent or important information, such as a warning. So you might see them on gov.uk alongside like a little exclamation banner for warnings and things, where it might say, warning, you can be fined £5,000 if you do not register. So it's kind of giving people really urgent information and really emphasizing the fact that it's important. Again, you don't just use it to make something bold. If you wrap something in a strong tag, if you're using a screen reader, then you can think that it's really important information. But actually, if you just like the look of the bold text, then you've kind of added the emphasis when it was just a stylistic choice, and that's not what it should be used for. The idiomatic text element. This is a really interesting one because people often think that the I tag just means italics. And when HTML first came about, it did just mean italics, but over the years, during the different versions of HTML that have been released, its purpose has changed, and now it actually is a separate element called idiomatic text, and it should be used for text which has a different semantic meaning to the surrounding text. So for example, it might be an alternative voice or mood, it could be a different language, it could just be technical terms. So probably when we write things like WCAG, we probably should write them in idiomatic text elements, but you know, it's things like things that might be a bit jargony, I guess, or it can be for written thought. So if you're writing like a online blog or a novel or something, and you're kind of speaking with internal monologue, you might wrap them in something like an I tag. But we'll have a look at a good use of an idiomatic text element in a bit when we look at language. We have image elements, which are used for visual content. You have to give them an alt attribute. The alt text needs to describe the image, or if you don't want to describe the image, if it's just kind of purely for decorative purposes, then you still need to add an alt attribute to it. It just needs to be empty. If you don't add an alt attribute, which either has meaningful text in it or is blank, then the screen reader is just going to have a go reading out something like the file name, in which case it might make no sense at all. Some sort of content management systems and whatever will just add an ID to the name of the image, so you might just end up with absolute nonsense being read out. So in the two examples we've got, good alt text might be something like a tabby cat wearing sunglasses. Even though there's no picture on the screen, we can probably all imagine what that looks like. And then we've got a background JPEG, which has just got a blank alt text, and a screen reader, I'll just ignore this completely. We've got unordered list elements. An unordered list is when the read in order doesn't matter. So this is normally a bullet pointed list, but it just means, if you've got a bunch of stuff that you need and reading them in any order doesn't really matter, then use an unordered list. Yeah, so you might have something on the page that says to open a bank account, you need proof of address, a valid ID document, and a minimum deposit of £1. If you read them back to front or in any order you wanted, it doesn't really matter because the list of things is still complete. You might then use an ordered list element, which is an OL tag, where things really matter in the order that they're kind of listed. So for example, in a step-by-step process, you might say complete the following steps. Step 1, go online. Step 2, book your tickets. Step 3, pick your tickets up when you arrive. If you read that list in the wrong order, then you could get it wrong. If you turn up to pick your tickets up before you've booked them, then obviously that's in the wrong order. So ordered lists tend to be step-by-step process type things. Unordered lists are just blocks of stuff where it doesn't matter. We've got the anchor element, which is more commonly known as a hyperlink. So this is used to link to other parts of a page, other parts of the website, or other parts of the internet. So you can use a hashtag and you can link to an ID on the page. So we'll have a look at that in a bit when we look at skip links. You can also link to headings and things, which is commonplace. We have internal links where they're just linking to another part of the website. So you stick a / on the front and it'll use the same URL and just go to a different page on that particular website. Or you can link to a completely different website using a full link where we actually add the HTTPS at the start. Line break elements we have, which are used to force text onto a new line. So these should not be used to create white space on a page. This is something, again, which we do see a lot in accessibility testing, where you might have two sections and they're a bit close together. So you bash a bunch of line breaks in and it creates white space on the page. But the problem is when you hit that page with the screen reader, the line breaks actually have semantic meaning. So if you have a bunch of them in a row, then there's a risk that certain screen readers might actually read out like line break, line break, line break, line break, and it just doesn't make any sense. So a good use of a line break is something like an address where the formatting matters. You could want to put each line of the address on a new line. So you add a line break to the end and that forces the text to kind of wrap to the next line. That's a good example of one. But if you've got more than one line break in a row, that's usually a sign that you're doing something wrong. And in those cases, it's better to use CSS to kind of create bigger spaces between things. You can use thematic break elements or horizontal rules, as they're often called. The tag is HR, which stands for horizontal rule. I've kind of put down here that you should avoid using them as they're often not implemented consistently, and usually it's a way of breaking up content. And the problem with horizontal rules is a screen reader will read them out. So if you've got a horizontal rule in after every paragraph, the screen reader is going to read out page break every time it gets to the end of a paragraph. It's not that you should avoid using them altogether. Like, we tend to advise against using them, or at least add an ARIA hidden to them so that screen readers ignore them. But there might be a reason why you do want them in there. It's just that they tend to be used for stylistic purposes rather than their actual purpose. So for example, if you'd wrote a book and you wanted to put the book online and you wanted to note the end of each page so that somebody could kind of follow along. If they've got the physical copy of the book and you've put the copy of the book online, you might want to denote the end of a page, in which case putting a horizontal rule or a thematic break there would make sense. But most of the time, people tend to just use them in blog posts and things just to kind of split up things. If you've got a block quote in the middle of a a blog post or something, they'll put horizontal rules either side. In those cases, it's normally better to use CSS because the horizontal rule, it will get read out by a screen reader. It can be quite verbose if you've got them all over the place, but it's not to say don't use them. It's just if you don't definitely need them, then consider hiding them or using CSS to create a line on the page instead of something that has semantic meaning. The heading elements, we're going to look at headings in a little bit more detail than the other things. I know we've just whizzed through a whole bunch of stuff, but we're going to look at headings in a little bit more detail because these are some of the most common things that we see problems with. With headings, you can use the H1 tag, you can use a H2, 3, 4, goes all the way up to 6. They need to be marked up correctly. They need to be at the right level, and your headings need to be easy to understand. There's different criteria that headings need to meet. And if you kind of do those 3 things, then you should kind of meet them all. So the first thing is making sure you mark up the headings correctly. For example, you can't just make the text on a page big and bold and expect it to behave like a heading. So you can apply a class which might be large and bold to a paragraph, and it'll look like a heading on a page. But then when you're using something like a screen reader, it won't actually recognize that as a heading. So you lose all that functionality, which I'll show you in a bit with the screen reader. But if you have an actual heading on the page, and that's to structure your content properly, you need to make sure that you use the correct heading tag. So you might have a H1 at the top of the page, then you'll have H2s underneath that, H3s, and so on. In most cases, if you've got to go kind of past a heading level 4, then your page probably is too complicated and you could probably break it up into more pages to make it a bit more user friendly. It's very, very rare that you need level 5 and level 6 headings. Oh, I've just explained what the next slide was, but yeah, basically, yeah, if you've got more than sort of 3 or 4 heading levels, your page is probably too complex. Our content design principles and whatnot are about keeping things simple, and in most cases, you'd be not going past sort of heading level 3 or heading level 4. Your heading should be related. So if you've got a heading level 3 and it doesn't relate to a heading level 2 and it doesn't relate to the H1 at the top of the page, then usually you've done something wrong. So an example of this might be, you might have a page on COVID-19. So you might have a heading level 1 at the top that says COVID-19. Then you might have 2 level heading 2s, which are how to stay safe and how to get tested. And then under how to stay safe, you might have wearing a mask, washing your hands, social distancing. And under how to get tested, you might have getting a test if you're a key worker, getting a test for somebody in a care home. But if you look at any of those H3s, they directly relate to the H2 above it. And those H2s directly relate to the H1 on the page. That's kind of the correct way to do it. If you've got a heading that doesn't relate to the parent above it, then again, that's usually a sign that your content isn't structured properly. And you shouldn't use the wrong heading level for stylistic purposes. So one of the things that we see a lot is that by default, heading level 1s are bigger than heading level 5s. And sometimes people want the text to be smaller, so they'll use a heading level 5, but that isn't the correct heading level. Actually, what they wanted was a heading level 2, but they just wanted it to look smaller, in which case we should use CSS for that. So in the Gov UK design system, we've got different, you've got Gov UK heading L, you've got Gov UK heading M, Gov UK heading S, so small, medium, and large, and you can apply those styles to make the page look how you want, but the semantic structure of the page is still using the correct levels, which is super important. So there is a demo of heading levels here. So here's the first point at which things could go drastically wrong, but we've got the same example that I gave before, where you've got a bunch of different heading levels around COVID-19, and then you've got a bit of content underneath them. So hopefully, if I bring up the rota here, we're going to be able to just cycle to the headings list, and we're going to be able to look at all of the headings, and then that way we can decide very quickly what part of the page we want to look at. So even if we can't see the page, we can very quickly learn what's on it. We bring the rota up.
Landmarks menu. Windows spot menu. Links menu. Headings menu. Heading level 1, COVID-19. Heading level 2, how to stay safe. Heading level 3, wearing a mask. Heading level 3, washing your hands. Heading level 3, social distancing.
Then we might decide social distancing is the bit that we want to know about.
Heading level 3, social distancing. Standing 2 meters apart will reduce airborne transmission of the virus.
So basically we brought a list of headings up. We were then able to see all of the different sections of the page. We navigated to social distancing, which was related to how to stay safe. And then it told us that we need to stand 2 meters apart, which will reduce airborne transmission of the virus. So the language attribute is the next thing. This one is probably going to be a little bit intense to follow along to, but the language attribute must be set on each page, and this is so that assistive technology such as screen readers will pronounce words correctly. So it must be set on any block which uses a different language to the rest of the page, and it must be set on the page itself. So usually we set the language of the page on the HTML element, which is the very first element in the document. So at the top of every web page, you'll find the HTML element, and then you need to add the lang attribute to that. So we can add something like lang equals en, and that is code for English, and that tells screen readers that the language on this page is English. We don't have to add it to every element because it's inherited from the children. So if you have something like the body tag, and then you've got a paragraph within the body, you don't have to set the language attribute on every element because they'll just go all the way up through all the elements until they eventually get to a lang attribute. So the outermost container that has it on, everything inside of that, unless you tell it to be different, will automatically inherit from that. So if we put it on the HTML element, we don't need to put it on the rest of the page unless the language is different. If you have a different part of the page, which is in a different language, then you need to specify that that block is different. So in this example, we've got lang equals en on the HTML tag, which tells the screen reader, you know, the majority of this page is in English. But then when we get down to the second paragraph, it's got language equals fr, which tells the screen reader, actually, the text inside of this block is in French. So don't read it out in the English pronunciation because it's different. It's quite simple when the entire block is different because you just apply it to the paragraph tag or the heading or whatever it is that's in there. But it can get a little bit more complex when you've got two languages in the same block. So this is when we were talking about that idiomatic text element earlier, and we were saying if you use the idiomatic text element for different languages, then you can apply different languages to that tag. Just to kind of reiterate, don't use a span because spans are purely decorative and certain screen readers will just ignore them. So I think VoiceOver, I don't know if it does in the latest versions, but in some of the older versions, if you put a different language on a span, VoiceOver just ignored it completely because it sees spans as decorative. So in this example, we have a paragraph, and that is sometimes people mix languages in a paragraph, but they don't apply the correct language attributes, c'est la vie. And the last sort of sentence is a different language, so we've wrapped that in the idiomatic text element and then told the screen reader that actually this bit of that paragraph is in French. You might see examples of linking to Welsh. So this is kind of a real world example of where you would use this stuff, because I guess the previous bits have been a bit conceptual. In a real world service, we have to add links to the page, which tell the user that the page is also available in Welsh. And most of the time we do that by writing the word Welsh in Welsh, in which case we have to tag it using the lang attribute equals cy. If we put a link on that says Cymraeg, we then need to add the Welsh language attribute to that because it isn't English anymore. So in the English version of the page, we have language equals en on the HTML tag, and then we have lang equals cy on the link, which also says this page is available in Welsh, but it's written in Welsh. And then when you switch the page, if you click on that link and it converts the page into Welsh, now suddenly it's the other way around. So you need to add HTML lang equals cy onto the HTML tag because the majority of the page is now Welsh. But on the English version where it says this page is also available in English, you would then have to add the en tag to tell the screen reader that actually, although everything else is in Welsh, this one small part is in English. So you have to kind of keep track of the different languages. And if you're switching between them, you have to make sure that for every bit where you're using a different language to the main language of the page, then you also tag that up. So I'm going to try a example of that. My voice control was a bit flaky with this morning when I tried it. It did work sometimes and it didn't work others, so hopefully it'll work. But you'll hear that it reads out on the good example, it's got a different pronunciation.
Heading level 1, language attribute demo. Heading level 2, add example. Sometimes people mix languages in a paragraph, but they don't apply the correct language attributes. C'est la vie. Heading level 2, good example. Sometimes people mix languages in a paragraph, but they don't apply the correct language attributes.
C'est la vie.
So hopefully, again, that worked and you heard that. But In the good example, when it gets to the bit that's actually French, it completely changes the voice and it uses a French speaker, which then means that it pronounces all of the French words correctly. Whereas in the first example, the voice for the English language just had a go pronouncing it and got it completely wrong. So that's why we use the idiomatic text element and apply the language attributes. The page title element is the next thing that we're going to have a bit of a look at, because again, we see a lot of times, where you just have the same page title on every page of a website, and it becomes really difficult to kind of for a user to work out where they're at. So every single page needs to have a unique and descriptive title, and this is so users can orientate themselves quickly and find content. It should tell them what page they're on and what website they're on. And if it's something like a gov.uk service, it might also tell you that this is part of a bigger website again. So for example, you might have a page where it says, what is your name? Apply for universal credit, gov.uk. Or you might have just two parts where it says tools and resources, DWP accessibility manual. But there should be no ambiguity as to what page you're on and what website you're on. We set the page title in the head element in the HTML. This should be different on every page, but you might have something like report a sighting of an excellent cow, gov.uk. The page title also shows up on the tabs. So, even sighted users get the page title, but it means if you're using a screen reader and you are flicking between tabs, you're very quickly able to figure out what page you're on, what website you're on, and kind of find your place again. The next thing we're going to look at is landmarks. So landmarks break the page down into defined areas, which helps people using assistive technology to find content easier. Again, like I was saying at the start, the boilerplate HTML examples are missing major landmarks. They literally have a body tag and very little else. Actually, what we need to do is inside that body tag, we usually have, you might have a sidebar, you might have a main area, you might have a navigation menu, you might have a header and a footer. All of those things need to be tagged up so that, if you can't see the screen or you're using assistive technology in whatever way, you can jump around the page a lot easier. The main kind of landmarks that you'll come across are main, header, footer, navigation. You might have a form, you might have an aside, a region, a section, or a search sort of function. Aside, we don't see that often. It tends to be content that's loosely related to the main content, but isn't exactly the same. So say you're reading a blog post about a particular topic, an aside might contain similar articles. It's closely related, but it's not relevant completely. Regions and sections you might use, but we tend to just have the main ones. So the ones you should definitely be looking at are main, header, footer, navigations, forms, and probably search at some point. So the most basic pages are literally made up of a header, some page content, and a footer. And the header is usually at the top of each page, so that will contain things like your branding. So it might have a logo in there. It normally has something like a navigation menu in there. So in this basic example, we've got a header tag. Inside of there, we've got a logo. Then we've got a navigation menu, and inside the navigation menu, there's a list of links. And then this way we can just, that's a very basic header. Then we've got a really basic footer. So like the header, it's usually just the opposite. It's at the very bottom of the page, and it'll contain useful links and copyright information usually. So if you go on to the UK site, it normally has things like an accessibility statement, a cookies policy, a privacy policy, those sorts of things. And it'll nearly always have some kind of copyright information, just telling you that, you can't steal the content on the site. The main landmark is probably the most important landmark on any page, and the fact that they don't have that on the boilerplate is a bit concerning, but this is where the main content of the page goes. It's where your H1 goes to describe the content on that page, and it's all of the, whatever your page title is and all of that, all of the content that relates to that goes in the main landmark. So if you don't have one, it becomes very difficult for people to figure out what that page is actually about if they're using assistive technology. So it normally has a H1 at the top, and then you normally have a skip link, which we'll look at in a minute. But the skip link allows users who are using a keyboard to jump straight to the main content. If you've got to press the tab key every time you want to go to the next part of the page, you don't want to have to tab through a navigation menu that might have 20 to 30 links in it, because that means every time you change the page, you've got to press the tab key 20 or 30 times before you get to the the content that you want to be at. So the main landmark and the skip link are closely related, and we'll have a look at that in a second. So a little example of landmarks, we've got this page, which is very quickly being knocked up, but we've got a banner at the top, which has a navigation element in it. We've got a main tag, which has the main content of the page in. We've also got a sidebar. This might have some content related to help or phone numbers or whatever. And then we've got our footer at the bottom, which has some support links in it. So we're going to bring VoiceOver up, and we're going to have a look at how that kind of presents itself using the rotor. So we've got headings, as we saw
Heading
before.
level 1, heading level 2, heading level 2, landmarks menu.
And then we've got landmarks. So we can see here there's a banner, navigation, main, sidebar region, and content information. So the banner is the header, the navigation menu is obviously the navigation, then we've got the main, the sidebar, and the footer. That means we can quickly cycle through them and get to the bit that we want. So if we just want to get to the main content, we can do that.
Banner, navigation, main, heading level 1, landmarks demo. You are currently on a heading level 1.
So the rotor is often the way that people will navigate around, and just having everything marked up correctly means that they can just jump to the part of the site that they want. They don't need to bother with the navigation menu. They don't need to bother with the sidebar. They can just find the content that they want really quickly. So I said before that a main tag needs to have a skip link. These should always be provided at the top of a page so that users can very quickly get to the content that they need. Usually it's a case of in your body tag, the first thing that you put in there is the skip link, and it literally just links to the ID of the main tag. So you'd put ID equals main content or something on the main tag, and then you would link to that using a hashtag, which then means if you're a keyboard user, when you land on the page, you press tab once, you go to the skip link, you press enter to activate it, and you jump everything that's at the top of that page rather than having to tab through everything. You might also need additional skip links. So everyone, well, some people are aware that you need one at the top of the page, but actually you might need them if you've got other blocks of repeated content. So you really need a skip link for anything which is repeated on multiple pages, because once you've seen it once, you might not want to go through it again. So another example might be, you might have a social media feed in your sidebar where it pulls in all of your latest tweets. You might want to add a skip link to the top. So when people are tabbing through the sidebar and they get to the Twitter feed, there's a link above it that just says skip Twitter feed. And when you click that, you then end up further down the page. Anywhere where you've repeated blocks of content, consider having a skip link, because people with a keyboard might not want to go through it every single time. And skip links can look ugly. Like if you've got a big link at the top that says skip to main content, people say, well, it doesn't fit in with the design, or it moves the header down, or it looks weird. But they don't need to be visible all the time. They can be hidden, and then they can only, you can make them visible when they receive keyboard focus. So if you go on any gov.uk website and you hit the tab key, you'll get a big yellow skip link at the top of the page, but you can't see it unless you're using the keyboard. And I'll show you an example of that now. So if we go into our skip link demo, which is this one, we've got a big skip the main content link at the top, which is how we described it. It's the first thing in the body tag. This means when you're using a keyboard and you hit the tab key, the first thing you select is that. If you hit the tab key again, you're going to go into the navigation menu and you're going to have to navigate through that before you then get into the page. By using the skip link, you can actually jump straight over the navigation menu and then you're into the page. So you don't have to do that extra tabbing around to get to it. If you want to hide it, there are ways to do it. So we can use a little bit of CSS. So, in this case, we've positioned it absolute. We've made it 1 pixel wide. We've pushed it right up to the top left-hand corner of the page, and it's so small you can't actually see it. Then if we then refresh the page, our skip link is gone, but it's still the first thing in the body. So if you hit the tab key, it's still the first thing in the body, and it actually only appears when it's focused now. So you can still use it and you can jump the navigation menu, but it just means that your page doesn't have to look ugly, which is sometimes the complaint that we get when we tell people to use skip links. Form elements, there are a bunch of other really important elements, which probably are basics or fundamentals, but we're going to cover them in a separate session tomorrow. So if you are interested in looking at forms and buttons and inputs and those sorts of things, there's a separate session going on tomorrow. You can sign up for that and we'll go through just form elements in a bit more detail. And that is everything. So I appreciate, I've absolutely flew through that. If there's any of the demos people want to see again, or any questions or any of that sort of stuff, just let me know, and I can replay any of it, or answer any questions or whatever.
There is a question in the chat. What should you use if you just want italics? And I was going to ask a similar question. What should you use if you just want bold?
Yep. So if you just want it for stylistic choices, you would use the span element. So where is it? So we talked before about the span element. This is purely decorative. You can wrap parts of a sentence in a span element. And if you wanted, in that case, if we just wanted this bit where it says blue to be bold, we could also add a class there which just said bold. And doing it that way, a screen reader will ignore it. It'll completely ignore span as any kind of emphasis. It'll literally just read it out as if none of that styling's there. So if it is purely to make something bold, you can add it as a class to the wrapping tag, or you can add it as a span if you need to do it inline. I guess the plain devil's advocate, in most cases, when you make things bold, it's to draw attention to them. So if you're making it bold, you've always got to ask the question, is something like emphasis better, or is something like using a heading better? But if there is a reason purely to have it styled in bold, then just use CSS and use a class and use a span tag.
If you were going to do that with, say, italics, if you just wanted it visually to be in italics, you put span. Can you then add a style attribute within the span?
Yeah, so it would just be a case of, like, in your CSS or whatever, you might have a p tag, you might have some text in there, and then it would be a case of doing your CSS where you would do something like, so you might have a class where you say class equals italic, and then in here you would just make a class called italic, and then in there it would be something like font style italic, and then that way it would style it, but it wouldn't give it any semantic meaning. So when the screen reader gets to it, it would read out, this is italic, but it wouldn't emphasize it in any way. Whereas if you used something like an idiomatic text element, then that would probably be incorrect because it isn't in a different voice, or it doesn't need emphasized or whatever.
Brilliant, thank you.
Are B tags still valid for bold text styling?
Yeah, so B tags will normally render it out in bold text. This is a good example for showing you how MDN works, because off the top of my head, I don't know. So I'm pretty sure that bold tags will just add the styling, they won't emphasize, but we'll go to MDN and I'll show you how that works and we can look at it together. So if you go to MDN, this is what you'll get. Up here, you can search for anything. So before we were just talking about span elements, you can look up spans, you can look up paragraphs, you can look up all sorts. So if we look up the B tag, the bring attention to element. So this will tell you, it says this is to draw the reader's attention to elements' contents, which are not otherwise granted special importance. This was formerly known as bold, and most browsers still draw the text in bold, but you shouldn't use it for styling text. Instead, you should use CSS. Yeah, so this is basically saying don't use it and use strong if it's for special importance, or use CSS font weight if you want to create a bold typeface. So this is basically saying it's deprecated, but I think you can use it. It just might not be as consistent as using other things. Sometimes they've got accessibility considerations in here as well, but it doesn't look like they've got any. And then it'll also link to the HTML standard, so you can have a look at it as it was written and how it was intended. So you can sort of have a look at that as well. But I would say based off that, that we've just looked at, you can use it and it'll probably work fine, but it's saying realistically you should use strong for strong importance, or you should just use CSS to style it.
Pooch has asked, if no language is specified on the HTML element, then does VoiceOver default to English?
In a nutshell, it'll just take a guess, and normally it'll default back to the operating system language. So if you've got, so Nikki's actually a really good example of this, because Nikki sometimes sends us documents which have been written on her device, which is set to finish, and then when we go into them with things like JAWS or whatever, they read out and finish. So if you've got a setup where you might use multiple languages. So some of our colleagues who speak Welsh might have the default language of their operating system set to Welsh, but then they might have their screen reader set to English, which will override it. In those cases, it would default back not to English. But in 99% of cases, if it's an English speaking person, they'll be using English on their operating system. And if you don't specify it on the tag, it will just default back to it. But there's no guarantees. Some people do have different settings because they speak multiple languages, and there's no guarantee which one it'll use unless you specify it. If you leave it off, it'll make your HTML invalid. In most cases, it'll probably still work, but there are cases where if people speak multiple languages or whatever, you're just kind of leaving it up to the screen reader to take a punt on what language it should use. But it shouldn't use a language that it's not used to using. Like, it wouldn't randomly just pick a language that you didn't use on your computer. It'll just use the one that you're used to using. So I don't know if that explains it, but yeah, it should just default back to English.
Can landmarks sit inside other landmarks? So, for example, a form inside a main.
Yeah, so you've got high level landmarks and you've got kind of other elements. So normally something like a main tag wouldn't sit inside of something else. But again, if we use MDN, you can look at different landmarks and it'll tell you what content it can and can't contain. So like a navigation menu, for example, can definitely sit inside of a header. But then something like a main you wouldn't put inside of a header because they're both top level landmarks. There is a section somewhere. MDN does explain kind of top level landmarks and sub level landmarks, if you like. So you wouldn't put a main inside of a header, you wouldn't put a header inside of a footer, but you might have something like a nav inside of a header, or you might have a nav inside of a footer. But for the most part, the top level ones you wouldn't put in other things, but you can. If we went to something like a main tag, it'll tell you what you can put inside of it, which is flow content. And then if you go into flow content, that'll tell you what those things are. So you can put any of these elements inside of a main tag. Whereas if you go to something like a p tag, it'll tell you what you can put inside of it, which doesn't really contain anything. It'll just say permitted content is phrase and content. So you can't put like a main tag inside of a p or something like that. There are rules, and that'll sit with the HTML5 spec. The HTML5 spec is a bit crazy. You know, if you look at the spec, it's really difficult to make sense of any of it. So using MDN does break it down a little bit. I tend to use MDN just because I find it easier to understand. But ultimately, what you can put inside of it is defined by the spec. And if we go to the spec document, that'll tell you again what you can and can't put inside of it. This is the spec. The spec is crazy. Like, if you look at the table of contents, it's just one giant, massive information, which is why MDN is really good for breaking it down. But inside of the spec, there's specific rules that are written for every single element. But MDN does a much better job of breaking them down as to what you can and can't use. So if you're not sure what it can contain, then just kind of go here, look it up and say, you know, what can I put in it and where can it be? So like their permitted parents for the nav element is any element that accepts flow content. So then you can look at the main and you can say, well, that does accept flow content. But also, if you're ever unsure, just run your HTML through something like a validator and it should pick up if you're using it incorrectly.
Are there any tools like Chrome Mozilla extensions following to MDN content rules and existing pages which can help in accessibility?
We use a bunch of different plugins. If I use my blog, this can probably show you how to run some of these things. So we use tools which are automated accessibility tools. So we've got Arc, we've got Wave, and we've got Axe, which we use. These will find common accessibility problems, but before you run them tools, normally it's better to check that your HTML is actually valid. So we normally you can use the W3C validator. In this case, you can go here and you can give it a web address, or you can upload a HTML file, or you can actually just copy and paste the HTML code directly into here, and it'll sort of tell you. So hopefully, fingers crossed, it'll say that there's it's fine. If it's got some errors, I'll fix them. But it's going to tell us now if I've got any HTML errors, and I have. So I've got I've got an attribute which isn't allowed on meta tags at this moment in time, apparently. And then I've added a role of banner to a header, which has an implicit role of header. Every element has what we call an implicit role. We'll cover this in the ARIA talk a little bit later on in the week. But for old browsers, they might not. So for something like Internet Explorer 6, the header element won't exist. So we give it a role of banner so that it still supports it. So it's telling us that I don't need them, but it just means if somebody's using a really old browser, maybe it'll still work. So you can run it through here first. And then once you've run it through there, you can then run these automated tools. So if I go into something like Arc, I can then tell it to run the tests and it'll tell us what it finds. So it's found here that I've got problematic alt text. And it's saying in my alt text, I've used the word image or icon or something which I shouldn't have used. So my alt text on my logo is Craig Abbott's signature logo. So I've tried to define the fact that it's a signature and it's a logo, and they're complaining that I don't need the word logo in there. I could probably just leave it as Craig Abbott's signature and that would probably be fine. I'm not that worried about that, but that's a way that it can find some of the problems. So you can run Arc. Now I've run it again and it's not finding it because I deleted it out. And it's also saying I'm using a line break element, but I'm using it in the right place because I wanted to push my name onto thanks. So I'm not that worried about that either. But Arc, Axe, and Wave are really good. It's probably better to show you on a website which has way more errors. I've obviously tried to do mine as best I can. But yeah, if you use Arc, Axe, and Wave, they find a bunch of different things. So if it's passing on one, it might fail on another. So it is running all three. But there are automated tools you can use here.
Can I just say a huge thank you for taking the time out of your day to attend this. Obviously, I appreciate with losing yesterday, it does put some extra pressure on the week. So thank you for still making time in your calendars for this. And then finally, a huge thank you to Craig for preparing and delivering this and for sharing his extensive knowledge with us. I always learn something new.